Hello, and welcome to We Can Work It Out, the podcast that explores the history, present, and future of workers' rights. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Lord. In each episode, we're delving into the stories, struggles, and successes that have shaped working lives. From felony societies to people management, we welcome academics, activists, trade unionists, policymakers, and workers themselves to help us understand what fair work really means in a changing world. This episode's guest is Richard Whittle, Professor of AI and Public Policy at the University of Salford. And today we turn to one of the most pressing questions facing work and public policy. How should we understand the economics of generative AI and who ultimately pays for its promises? Professor Richard Whittle, welcome to We Can Work It Out.
Hi, great to be here.
Okay, so the first question that we ask every guest, Richard, is can you tell us more about yourself and how you became involved in researching and writing about artificial intelligence?
So my kind of background is economics. I'm an economist, and lots of my work looks at asset price bubbles. So you can probably guess where I'm going in terms of AI. In COVID, I was seconded to support a variety of combined authorities with their economic decision making. I was lucky enough to be awarded a CAPE fellowship, and part of that fellowship was connecting the latest academic research in COVID recovery and economic recovery and connecting that to particularly the mayoral combined authorities. That started to give me much more insight into the role of technology in managing the disruption of COVID, the role of making decisions in the extreme uncertainty of COVID, and really where we were going next. And that's what started me on my kind of journey of looking at AI, looking at its effects on our labour force, its effects on our economy, and its effects on how people make decisions. For me, the ultimate kind of role of the university, if we talk about the civic duty, is supporting people, that is large organisations, policymakers or individuals, in making decisions around AI and this uncertainty. So what I want to do is, with our research and with the tremendous resource of the university and academic knowledge creation, is to help policymakers make those decisions around AI investment, AI skills, help organizations decide which AI to use, which AI not to use, and what those AI decisions mean, and also help everybody try to work out what they need to do around AI. So one of the things that I'm kind of proud of, but also really shows how much this is impacting, is my inbox is full of parents asking what their kids should be studying at GCSEs, how to help them make decisions for this really quite turbulent and scary future we could be looking at.
So for the listeners then who don't know that much about it, can you explain what AI is in terms of your work and research, and what generative AI is and what the difference is between it?
So in terms of my research, we've been using what we would term artificial intelligence, but by AI, we can really talk about just getting something out of a computer program. We've been using AI for a number of years, and I've been using it to help me understand online communities in particular, but also what our economy is shaping to look like. And that type of AI is something that we tend to call more traditional AI or machine learning, where we're using a complex computer program to help really potentially sort data or help people in decision making. And then in 2022, to kind of public awareness, something came out called generative AI. I'm going to use the Turing Institute's definition here. Generative AI is generative means creating new content, new code, new images, new text, and AI means doing that with a computer program. So as most of your listeners will probably be aware and have probably used themselves, what we have are these tools, these generative AI chatbots, where we can give them a prompt or an instruction and they will give us an answer. So you could ask it to make a LinkedIn post or a report or an essay or something along those lines, and it will give you a version of that. Much of my research looks at the quality of these versions and what the quality means for our workplace or our economy. So I will generally argue that a generative AI output is not as good as a human output, or not necessarily as good as a human output, but what it is really quick and really cheap. And so for me, the impacts on the economy come when quick and done is actually preferred to human and expensive.
So you talked a lot recently about the pricing of generative AI, because from a novice perspective, I think it's fairly cheap in terms of subscriptions. And some people might not think that, but for what it can do, you could ask it to do virtually anything and it will produce something for you in a very, very quick period of time. What are your opinions of the cost of the use of generative AI? And do you think it's cheap? Do you think it's pitched at the right level? What's your kind of opinion of that?
So this new product has come to market, and generative AI, I would argue, is the first broad mass market use of AI or conscious use of AI. We have been using artificial intelligence. Netflix has told us what to watch, Spotify what to listen to, etc., for a very long time. That's all type of AI. But generative AI is actually where you as the user are able to give this an objective, and it comes back and does that objective. And it can be really impressive. You might have seen on my social media, I've been using this to create books, been using it to play computer games, create maps, those kind of things. And certainly we're seeing people creating reports, consultancy type reports very, very quickly with these tools. Now, their introduction has followed, or arguably follows, something called a blitz scaling model, which is a traditional Silicon Valley approach where the product is put into the market incredibly cheaply to garner market share. And we can certainly see this with these standard chatbots that we've all used. As you mentioned, they're incredibly cheap. You can access them for free. There are subscriptions that can be around £15, £20 a month, and pro level subscriptions, which can be £200 a month. But even that, compared to the outputs that you could get from them, can be very cheap. So one of the things that we do in my research is try to anticipate the price rises, because at the moment, these are being offered to the market at well below cost. We've seen in the news that the variety of AI firms are losing huge amounts of money, billions per month. And so we know from that that these models are underpriced. And so part of the question comes, what happens when you become dependent on this model in your organization and the price rises? So in terms of some of the documentation from these firms, they're suggesting a 10, 15-fold price increase over the next couple of years. That's quite significant. If you built a business model around virtually free access to these types of tools and suddenly they are relatively expensive, what does that mean for the products you can offer, for the uses internally and externally as well? So let me give you an example. We come across quite a few what we would term wrapper businesses. These are businesses that sell a product which is in essence an instruction that their customer gives them and they pass on to an AI firm. The AI firm, the generative AI firm, completes the instruction, sends it back to the firm, which then sells it back to their clients. And as an example, this can be a few pence to a few pounds, but suddenly that product may actually be significantly more expensive. So part of the question is, does that market still exist at a true price of artificial intelligence models?
When you compare it to kind of other earlier platforms, I'm thinking about things like Uber and social media. Was it the same kind of thing, where they wanted to get on them into the market and it was very, very cheap to utilize?
Absolutely. And even for some of these firms that you mentioned, profitability is still quite a long way away in their horizons. But what they have done is captured significant market share. So then you start to have, and this is one of my favorite words of the last couple of years, the enshittification of these services, where in order to get to profitability, value is gained from the consumer, from the businesses, but from the entire ecosystem. And actually, the products tend to become worse. They tend to become more expensive. And so what you will find is you're absolutely right with some of your analogies, that you come into a market, you get rid of competition, or you create and establish dependency on your product, and you make it very, very hard for customers to switch from your product, and then you ramp the price up. Now, part of my research queries whether you can actually do that with generative AI, because one of the things that we're seeing is that even though these have relatively powerful outputs, they tend not to be, in terms of human parity, as good. And so can businesses utilize them, become dependent, and fundamentally, will a business pay many thousands of pounds for a subscription at true price? Yes, we can see that businesses will use it when it is free or virtually free, because why wouldn't you? by definition, if you're trying a free product, your ROI is going to be positive. And so suddenly we get these products into our business, we establish what we call vendor dependency, where it's very, very hard to switch, and the price goes up. So in terms of labor, one of the things that we're starting to potentially notice is the effects on talent pipelines, where human talent is being replaced by facsimiles of it via artificial intelligence. Well, of course, if we roll the clock forward 5 to 10 years' time, actually we do not have that human level of expertise. We'll have to use AI expertise, and AI firms at that point can put the price up quite significantly because people will have no alternative.
That's really interesting. We'll probably come on to that a little bit more later as well. Just on the point about what generative AI can do, I know previously when we discussed things, and I always enjoy our discussions, didn't you write a PhD thesis in a really short period of time?
Absolutely. It is really, really powerful at doing, and it is not a good PhD thesis, but what it is, in my view, is a passable PhD thesis. There are differences there. Obviously, in terms of the PhD process, there's more to it than the thesis, but it's a significant chunk of it. So yes, these tools can do a lot. In my view, even though this may be shifting at the moment, there's some very good work come out over the last couple of weeks, which is pointing into a slightly more optimistic direction. But in my view at the moment, most of these outputs are not as good as a human would do given an appropriate amount of time. But quite simply, if I were given, as in that experiment, I gave AI 90 minutes to write a PhD thesis, it does a far better job in 90 minutes than I would do in 90 minutes. So I think that is the comparator. It is not as good as I would do over a PhD time, over 2 to 3 years, but it's a lot better than I would do in 90 minutes.
Yeah.
Again, this is where it comes out into the essays or the reports or whatever we might be discussing. Generally, it will not be as good as you can do. So let's say a student uses this to produce an essay. I am relatively confident that the students sat down with a lot of time and access to the library, etc., would get a higher mark by doing it individually, by doing it themselves, not with AI. However, if it is 10 minutes before deadline, before submission deadline, you might be tempted to utilize this because even though you could have got a better mark, you wouldn't do in that time period, for instance. But I think that also brings us on to one of my questions about AI, and again, part of my research. We talk about artificial intelligence as though this is the cause of lots of our problems. For me, it is much more of a indicator of existing problems. So if a generative AI model can get a worse mark than you could do, the question is not what can the AI model do? The question is, why is the student or the employee choosing to use that model? Because why are they choosing a lower mark, for instance, than they could get? The answer is usually economic. It's usually to do with wider characteristics. It might be that the student's working 2 or 3 jobs to manage their degree and doesn't have time to do everything, that kind of thing. And so these questions tend to be much more about the context and about really how we are going to start viewing our economy, because these tools generally will give a lesser version than a human could do. So why is the human choosing the lesser version? It tends to be for many, many other reasons rather than simply they're making that choice.
Do you think it's more of an assistant then rather than a replacement of somebody? So it can assist somebody doing something rather than actually replacing somebody holistically?
Ooh, that's a very good question. And I think ideally this should be an assistant to somebody. I am yet to see, and this may come in the future, but I am yet to see examples where it can really replace even many tasks of a role. I can think of a few, but where it's going to have real disruption. However, I can also see many tasks where an employer or the employee will prefer a less good output for far less effort or far less expenditure. And I think that is part of the danger that putting AI, I see lots of benefits from AI, but I think putting AI into a context of relatively low demand, relatively precarity in employment, some financial precarity as well, actually potentially forces an economy down a kind of race to the bottom where even though we know the AI output isn't as good, it is preferred because it is far, far cheaper. And so I do not think that AI should be replacing people for lots of reasons, actually. However, I think that that choice may be made from efficiencies and cost saving purposes rather than can AI do this job as well as a human.
So do you think organizations are being nudged towards automation then rather than because of the kind of cheaper pricing or accessible pricing?
I'm I'm going to first pick up on the use of the word nudge, because I think there are tremendous insight kind of parallels between behavioral insights and that policy program that we saw about 10 years ago and AI now. So behavioral insights, again, I've got a great paper on this with Stuart Mills looking at why government adopted behavioral insights. We argue that behavioral insights was necessary because it provided a micro foundation or a kind of facilitated the austerity agenda. We're able, from a government point of view, to go in and say, we're not going to fix this structurally. That'll be very, very expensive. What we're going to do is nudge people toward better decisions. We're not going to fix X, Y, and Z. We're just going to nudge people slightly in the right direction. A really cheap but plausible alternative. Now, I think that AI is seen in that same vein. Is seen as a panacea for costs. And so in many organizations that are really feeling the pinch right now, many organizations that are looking at the increasing cost of human labor are looking at AI not as this new tool to increase productivity and output, but actually as a tool to reduce costs. And by costs, unfortunately, I am talking about human labor. So I think there are two ways that you could be utilizing these tools. You can utilize them to create value, to create new, more output with the same level of resource, or you could use them to create the same level of output with less resource. And I fear it's that second path that we are going down. And it is that path that, to be perfectly honest, leads to stagnation. We'll just do the same things that we'd always have done, but they'll be a little bit cheaper. In terms then of job creation, in terms of value, I see that being quite limited because we are using AI solely to cut costs. Now, I always think, and I've reviewed many, many AI business cases for loads of organizations, AI savings do not get you economic growth. Certainly in the public sector. What gets you economic growth is taking those savings and using them for something that does generate growth. So if we are a council or a local authority or a combined authority, and we're using AI to cut costs in a variety of different services, the question really should be, what are we doing with that saving? What is that cost saving? What is that money that we freed up being used to do? Because we have created efficiencies, fantastic, but that does not generate the economic growth. What generates the economic growth is what we take that savings and do it. So if we put it into schools, education, skills, infrastructure, for instance, there are huge routes that we can see towards economic growth, but simple cost savings don't get us there. And I think that is the miscalculation of many organizations. Now, obviously, this is a slightly different calculation in the private sector, where actually we will potentially increase profitability. But certainly the public sector, we need to be saying, what are we doing with those savings and how are we going to utilize those savings to grow? That's one of the key aspects for me. There are a variety of others, but I think that really what we need to be talking about is how do we use these savings to get growth?
That's really interesting because we have a KTP, a knowledge transfer partnership, and it's with a charity, and they're trying to improve the digital maturity for staff and for the service users of the charity as well. As you know, with the KTP, it's about, it's after the project finishes, which is 2 years, you have a 5-year plan then in terms of growth, in terms of turnover and other measurements as well. And it's been interesting because it's nearly finished the KTP. So after 2 years, we've seen that where the cost savings aren't tangible, it's time. So the time has been saved because the staff are using technology to do their jobs, and they've been timed. We actually time them in doing tasks, and it isn't performance measurement. It's just, look, if you use technology, it can be a lot quicker, and then you can devote more time to supporting the service users or to submitting bids. And we've seen that, and they've been able to do other things. So that's how I've seen it. It's been an investment, like you said. It's a great example. It's an investment of that time that they've saved. They haven't just kind of said, well, we've got all this time now. It's like, what are you going to be doing with that time? And they've invested in other things, and they've been able to put more bids in. They've got some fantastic bids out of it purely because they're using technology.
Absolutely. And this brings on something that I find really interesting. And it's going to be one of the big questions. In much of the public sector, we see arguably self-reported time savings by using these tools. And yet we also don't see public sector cost savings translating through. Now, my argument is that many staff in the public sector are working or have been working more than they need to be, or more than they are paid to be. Generative AI is reducing that workload, but still not to a below full-time level. And so from a public sector point of view, you have the same input costs, you have the same output, so you're not seeing the cost savings. What you are seeing is the teacher who every night used to work till 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. and they're now working till 7 or 8 p.m. And that's a tremendous value. But how do we start to capture that? Because from a school's perspective, their staff wage bill is still the same, and the output, the hours the teaching delivered is still the same. The cost of delivering it used to fall onto the worker, and now it's actually being done, or some of the extra is being done by generative AI. So we are seeing a saving, or we're seeing a time saving, but we're not seeing a cost saving. And that's because that extra time wasn't necessarily paid for in the first place.
Yeah. Those intangible things. Well-being is another example. How do you measure well-being? You can look at sickness rates and things like that, but the well-being of workers is an interesting one because it is hard to measure sometimes. But it's a great example, about people who would take a long time because of the nature of the job to do tasks. And now those tasks are being reduced considerably. It's not being removed completely. It's like I keep talking about, I see it as an aid, as an assistant. Do you think from your perspective that there's going to be an effect on the workforce though? Do you think jobs will go? And I know it's hard, you haven't got a crystal ball. Do you think certain jobs will disappear and then new jobs will come out of it like we've seen in the Industrial Revolution previously?
So Industrial Revolution, great example. It's not one that I think quite fits, but I think it's good for one reason. The jobs at the end of the Industrial Revolution, I think we would agree there were more of them, they were more created. Going through the Industrial Revolution took a toll on the workers, certainly on living standards, certainly on a variety of what we would call well-being measures. So our job, and the job of the university and people who research this, is to not just look at the end outcome, but actually how do we get through that process as well? Because I personally think there's going to be a lot of disruption because of generative AI. Again, don't think it's not what I would call kind of valid disruption. Disruption based on a simple premise which goes, can we reduce the service quality here for a significant cost reduction? So what is our minimum viable quality in any particular area? So is it that I think you'll probably agree with me that if you ring up somewhere and you speak to an AI assistant, it is quite tedious and takes a while and doesn't necessarily do what it would do when you're speaking to a human. But do our overall call centers decide that they can live with that because running a call center of AI bots is significantly cheaper than running one with humans, for instance? So in all our theories, we shouldn't be preferring something that is worse than a human over a human, because we seek, in terms of AI, we want to seek human parity. Here, even though I don't think it's a good analogy, you'll hear constantly AI can pass this exam, or AI is at this level of insight, or whatever it might be. So that's not a particularly good analogy. What we do is we try to seek human parity. And the AI we have now is not at a human parity level in most tasks. So the question is, for our disruption, will our economy prefer something that is lower quality and cheaper over something that is better and expensive? I think there are some economies that will and some economies that won't. I think there are some regions in the UK that will and some regions in the UK that won't. So it's really, really hard to start making those predictions about disruption, because actually we're not talking really about the technology. We're talking about whether a human decision maker will decide whether okay and cheap is preferred to human and expensive. And depending on how that decision is made is whether you will see huge amounts of disruption or a relatively slow progress. Your other question was about job creation. And whilst I will take the line you gave, I don't have a crystal ball, what I am seeing at the moment is a huge amount of efficiency savings, a huge amount of cost reduction. And it is really hard to envision new job creation by doing the same things that we've always done, just a little bit cheaper.
How does the UK compare to other countries then in terms of the use of generative AI, we'll call it?
An excellent question, and not one that I can really answer off the top of my head. The UK's economy, for want of a better word, is a little bit strange. It has quite significant government debt, also huge household savings at the moment. At the moment, the UK, this has never happened before. At the moment, the UK's household saving rate is around Germany's. That's never happened before. With reports of about a £1 trillion war chest in terms of household savings. That is huge. Now, the question I would ask you is, why are people saving? Are they saving because they're optimistic and they're thinking that actually we've got some investment coming, we're just waiting for the right bits of technology and everything else? Or are they saving because they're worried about the future? Now, I don't know the answer, but that's going to partially determine what happens with AI. Is our economy buoyant, producing, or is it cautious and stagnating?
Well, I wasn't aware of that. Again, I'm not really an economist, and I know you keep on track with that because it's obviously an interest to your research. But when you read the news and you hear about things, you hear that just the dire aspects of things. I wasn't aware about that household savings aspect of it, and I can understand why a lot of people are probably feeling a bit nervous, which could be in relation, it could be in relation to technology and replacement of labor as well. But the other point you mentioned, which I find really interesting, because we do look at sometimes the history of labor as well. If you look at what happened to the mining industry especially in the 80s, that was replaced, and there wasn't really a plan put in place to look at reskilling and finding other sectors of industries to replace the mining industry. And a lot of people, even the trade unions, were accepting sometimes that things were going to change, and what they wanted really was what's coming next. And that happened in Germany. Germany were fantastic in finding other industries and other manufacturing areas to reskill and retrain a lot of the workers in that sector. And that's where I think a lot of the problems come from with things like technology being introduced.
I think you're right. And so one of the things that is quite rightly sold as a tremendous win for the UK, we are the third largest services exporter in the world. However, generative AI is particularly good at doing services. So is where our economy sits globally will then start to answer some of these questions. I think there is tremendous concern that we have, in essence, zero sovereign capacity in this space. So all the models that we've talked about ultimately represent money flowing out of the UK system. So those efficiency savings have got to be quite significant if they've got to compensate for money flowing out, if they've got to compensate for potential job disruptions, those kind of things as well. And so our overall position is, I would say, arguably quite problematic, because even though I think there are some positives in the UK economy, certainly compared to much of the media picture of what it is, I think there are some positives in the UK economy. I would also argue that we may just be getting towards a tipping point where growth starts to pick up and productivity accompanies that. However, at the same time as all that, we have fundamentally a public services sector buckling under 30, 40 years of underinvestment and austerity as well. We can talk about virtually any one of our services, any one of our public services isn't necessarily working how it should be. And we have a relatively creaking infrastructure, whether it is public transport, whether it is skills, whether it is education, whether it is our care system, whatever it might be. And on top of that, you stick AI. Now, for me, you put AI into virtually any system, and what it does is it shows its weaknesses. It shows the weaknesses of our system. And we are not going to fix 30 years of serious underinvestment by some quick short-term AI cost cutting. We have significant structural economic issues in the UK. We have a huge student loan burden. According to some figures, our current student loan burden is around 10% of our national debt. That's unheard of. Our housing market is chaotic, stagnant, growing, absolutely overpriced, and prices people out. The vast majority of people in the UK are buckling under a cost of living crisis. We still have inflation, even though it is reducing. Inflation is still running at 3%. There's still some core sticky inflation around food prices in particular. People are, inflation still means prices are going up. 3% inflation means prices aren't going up as fast as they were, but they are still increasing. And so our economy is not necessarily in the best shape to deal with AI. I think there are some positives in our economy, ones that we need to talk about more, but it is not in the best shape to deal with AI. And of course, there's huge geopolitical aspects as well around what does this mean. There's lots of political turbulence within the UK as well. We've got our local elections coming up. We've got a variety of by-elections. We've got significant political rumblings within the Labour Party, within the opposition, within Reform as well. And so what actually does our picture look like? Are we putting AI into a stable, growing economy? Or are we putting AI into an economy which is potentially looking quite fragile and uncertain?
Can we focus on the public sector, because that's where a lot of your research and your recent research is focused upon? Why do you kind of focus on the public sector, and is it particularly exposed to generative AI?
Public sector, I mean, arguably, yes, it is particularly exposed to generative AI. Much of, and I don't want to kind of generalize here, much of a public sector activity is relatively algorithmic. You have this process to go through. When this happens, this, and this are the responses, that kind of thing. But also, and I think this is just well worth reiterating, the public sector is exposed to AI because we are desperate to cut public sector costs. We saw the Chancellor saying that generative AI would reduce civil service running costs by 15%. We see a operational bill that is increasing at a time where the economy isn't necessarily growing and those tax receipts aren't coming in. And we're seeing a public sector decision maker view that AI can be this panacea for costs. It can cut costs and it can stop costs rising as well. I would not necessarily agree with that, but when you are desperate, when you really need to cut the costs, then you can make that decision a lot more easily. And that decision is, do I want high quality, human and expensive, or do I want low quality, quick and done?
And what about the cost side of it for the public sector? Are they more exposed from the cost side of things in comparison to the private sector?
So in terms of the current trials that we've seen, where in essence, in many large government departments, some generative AI tool has been put in at really low cost or free as part of their ongoing agreements, and they have found a return on investment for it. So what we do not know is, does that return on investment still exist at a higher or a true price of AI? Because if you have in some of the surveys some of the studies have been on 20,000 civil servants. If we give them a free generative AI tool, it is likely they will find some positive return from having it. If we gave them that tool at true price, would they still find a positive return? Actually, I don't know, but I think it's something that we should be asking.
Yeah. When we talk about the public sector, have you done any research, or do you know anything about the NHS and the usage of generative AI?
I actually, in terms of the health side, I know very little. I taught a group of NHS students last week, so I'll recount the discussions, but I will kind of nod to it coming very much from them rather than myself. So the first thing in healthcare is, that minimum quality that we talked about, that is around human parity level. Yep. We tend not to in healthcare go, actually, we're going to do a worse job because it's cheap. We tend to have expectations and standards. So that minimum viable quality is actually really high, which gives the health service some buffer from it, or from kind of reliance and dependency on it, because you still need it to get to a human parity level, which it can't do. So what are the things that it is doing within our health service? It's doing lots of transcription. It's doing lots of note taking. It's doing lots of writing up of case notes as well. So I'm going to talk about a discussion because I do not know the answer to this, but I think it's well worth pointing out that in many cases, if people aren't writing up their own notes and they're as familiar with their case load as they used to be, for instance, how do we see this playing out in the NHS? Actually, I see a much greater role for the kind of precision type models that we talked about earlier. The precision type models of significant data science, of being able to predict different health outcomes, that kind of thing, and being able to support people. But that raises another question. And that question, quite simply, is, do we have the resource to make this happen? So let's say we have an excellent AI system that is able to predict with a decent amount of accuracy if somebody needs said test in the UK. The question then becomes, of course, do we have the ability to roll out the test to the people that we've identified? And quite often the answer is no. We do not have the extra capacity to increase all those GP visits or to increase those types of tests or whatever it might be. So remember, for me, AI just highlights the weaknesses in your system. And those weaknesses are usually about resource investments and economics, about whether or not we can actually operationalize the insights, whether or not we are being forced to use something that is not as good as it could or not as good as we would like it to be simply because it's cheap.
What's the regulation like around generative AI in terms of it being used ethically and obviously not to break the law, but also the competition side of it as well? So there are two aspects of that. First of all, what's the kind of regulation around the use of it? And then the second part is the competition around it as well.
So, firstly, these tools are very new, and as we've found in many examples, regulation struggles to keep up. But there are a variety of kind of globally standard AI acts. So the EU AI Act, for instance, absolutely key. What you will find is that prohibits particular activities around deep fakes, around using AI as an impersonation, around the types of content that can be generated. But as we have seen quite recently on a number of different examples, those regulations do not necessarily keep up with the public use of these tools and the actual availability or even uncertainty about what some of these tools can do. I think there is a huge amount of ethical questions to come, both about how these tools are made or how they're developed and how they're used. One of the things I think is particularly interesting, and I think it's a pertinent question, is if you were to develop some of these tools that are being recommended by different universities, for instance, would that development process pass the university's ethics system? Would you be able to, for want of a better word, utilize copyrighted material to train a model and then use it? Would that get through your university's ethics approval process? I doubt it. And yet we are using these tools within the university system. Likewise, would many of these tools get through NHS ethics? And yet we are using them in the NHS. So there are big questions about what this can mean, what this can mean for organizations, what this means for individuals. One of the things I think is really important to talk about as well is actually what does this mean in terms of inequality? These tools, again, I'm going to make my caveat, not as good as a human, but usually the expensive versions, the pro versions, are better than the free ones. So, there's a simple question. You're sat in your class, you ask your students to do something with AI. The ones who can afford £20 a month will get a better answer than the ones who can't. The organizations that can afford 20, 30,000 pounds a year subscriptions will get better outputs to sell than the ones that can't. And so we have significant discussions around inequality and what does this mean? Can we democratize access to these tools? Should we? Should we conceptualize it as a public good, for instance? I'd certainly argue yes, at least to an extent, that most of our systems need to look at accessing AI tools not as a nice to have in many cases, but actually as a relatively basic necessity in some of the ways that we talk around the ability to access data or access the internet, those kind of things.
Do you think it should be some kind of quasi-public utility then, possibly?
I think that would be a very interesting approach. I also think it'd be a very expensive approach. And so we come right back to our initial question of, can we afford the AI we want to have?
Yeah.
Because if we can't, and what are we going to settle for? And it is that settlement process which determines the impact on jobs, on the economy, on society as well. There's lots of things that we could get into. One of the things I think is really well worth discussion is about the use of these chatbots is companionship, as loneliness aids, that kind of thing as well, because you can start to see quite damaging impacts on society. And there's an excellent book, which I will have to send it to you in editing because I can't remember who wrote it, but it's called Love Machines. It talks about people using these bots basically as a really cheap way of dealing with loneliness. And it postulates at the end that we could approach the loneliness epidemic in much of the UK or Western Europe. We could approach it through a structural, expensive way, or we can give everybody a chatbot for cheap. And it ends with, what are we going to do?
Yeah. My children use Snapchat and I check it every now and again. I don't kind of just to make sure they're all right. Really, I'm a big believer in freedom of speech, and I don't think it should be restricted on devices. I think parents should monitor them. So I do monitor it, and then that's when I first saw this Snapchat AI, and one of my children was discussing it. We had a discussion with it, and it had a conversation. And I didn't want to read all of it because it obviously must have been private. But I was shocked, really, about just that it was there, and I didn't really know about it. Then you start to worry and think, who's managing and monitoring the responses? Because there must be something behind it, which is human led. It must be in some form, even though it's generative AI. At the end of the day, it's been generated, it's been designed by humans. So there's always that worry behind things like that as well, and that must be a major concern for this type of thing.
Absolutely. I think much of the concern comes because actually that human involvement in some ways is quite limited, where people have taken general models and stuck them in essence into toys. And so suddenly somebody using a toy, a young child, is able to converse with a bot about virtually anything with very little guardrails on there. One of the things that you will see, again, people will talk about this as the kind of the Wild West, and it's happening really quickly. One of the things that happens really quickly is, remember, we famously break things, and we're seeing quite a few examples of data breaches. So many, there was one quite recently where I think it was 50,000 chats between children and their AI toys were just available online for anybody to go and read. This is hugely problematic because this is a very, very new space, and our rules. Remember what I said about the university ethics system on whole, or the NHS ethics system? The rules that we are using can't keep up with actually these new types of technologies. This is a whole new approach that is required in terms of looking both about where we are and where we are going to get to as well. And of course, where do we want to be?
Yeah, that's the question I always ask about these things. Where do you want to be with it? I'm trying to think of the Uber case, because with Uber, they obviously swamped the market, and then a lot of competition fell by the wayside, or they were kind of gobbled up by Uber, which is fine. That's the way competition works. But is there an issue or potential problem where pricing power consolidates in a smaller number of global firms, and then it has an impact on national sovereignty, public spending, and democratic oversight as well?
Absolutely. We have a very small number of huge firms with with market share and legislative monopolies being enacted around them to continue to support those firms. We won't go into it because it's a full discussion itself, but the geopolitics of all this are really quite problematic as well. So where are we going to end up? We, as the UK and Europe, do not have this type of capability. We may or may not choose to invest in it, but we do not have it at the moment. And so all these efficiency savings we're talking about, our 15% reduction in civil service costs, is in essence at the whim of some global organizations where, in terms of geopolitics, we may or may not have much say or even friendship with. And so we're starting to get to quite a, for want of a better word, interesting picture about what our future could look like. Are we becoming dependent on these systems that we do not own? I think when you become dependent on something, you lose lots of agency and power around it. And I think that is one of the big questions. And then, of course, we have simpler questions, which is why we're becoming dependent on a system that's not as good as a human. And for me, the answer is the same to all those questions. At the moment, we're doing it because we need to, because our economy is not performing particularly well.
So what kind of questions should organizations be asking themselves before embedding this type of system into their operations?
For me, there's a few simple questions. The first one is, does your business model still work if instead of paying nothing, you're paying £10,000 a month for this AI platform, this AI service? What happens at a 30, 40, 50 50 times increase in cost. And that helps you do two things. Firstly, it stress tests your business to see if it's viable. Secondly, if it is, it helps you create or find the actual value in this. Because last year, Microsoft and OpenAI, and I think it was Claude as well, invested the equivalent of the GDP of Portugal in data centers. That is a huge, huge investment, obviously. They are doing that to see a return. At the moment, they are not seeing any return, and that is going to need to be paid for. The estimates are around 3 trillion at the moment is being spent on the development and rollout of these tools. That needs to be paid back, and it needs to be paid back with interest. Again, do not invest their money for no return. They invest it to get a return on it. So at some point, there'll be, in essence, a reckoning where you need to pay more for these tools, or the quality will decrease rapidly and it will be much more rationed. Again, then you come to our inequality arguments from earlier. But what you will have is a price increase in one way or another. Again, that price increase may come in terms of actual pounds, it might come in terms of rationing, might come in terms of quality. But you need to ask yourself, from a business perspective, can we stand whatever we think is a likely increase in prices, and then double that likely increase in price, in my humble view. The second question is, if we're using this for efficiency purposes, do we still have the expertise in 3 or 4 years to be able to make independent judgments about this? Because one of the things that we certainly are beginning to see is a lack of talent pipeline in any organizations. We're seeing a recognition that we require that kind of middle and top expertise, but the process of creating new experts is certainly stalling, and I would argue stalling because of AI. Not necessarily because AI can do the job, but because people can see it as a cost reduction to maybe do that job. And so the second question is, in X amount of time, can we still independently make decisions about this AI output? Can we still say if this report, output, presentation, code, etc., is good? And actually, we need to maintain that capacity. So how do we do it? How do we do it over the longer term? The third
You've
thing.
mentioned. Sorry, go on, Richard. Yeah, go on. Sorry, yeah, go on.
I was going to say the third thing is consider your position in the market, because AI means that you have got new competitors. It means that the large organizations that didn't previously bother with your segment of the market can now come into that segment of the market. It means that the small, nimble organizations can also come into your segment of the market. So for many people, AI will mean that you have got new types of competitors and you're in a new competitor race, because when we're talking about that dependency, there's always a new model. There's always something better on the horizon. And so are you getting into a race where you constantly need to utilize that higher model, pay more for it? Where are you going as a business? So that for me is the kind of 3 aspects. Firstly, can we deal with price rises? Secondly, from a business perspective, can we maintain our expertise and USP given our current decision making? And thirdly, what is happening with our competitors as well? What does our business or industry or sector look like after 5-10 years of AI? But I think most of all, any business that I speak to, my advice is simple. What are the long-term costs of your short-term efficiency savings?
You mentioned skill shortages. I know you've done some research around this. We had a chat about it a while ago, didn't we? In terms of the public sector, what are your understanding of potential skill shortages?
To be perfectly honest, Jonathan, that's a really, really hard question, because these things are changing so quickly. And so one of the things that happens when you have this type of uncertainty and change is organizations fall into something that I and James Ransom, who I write with at UCL, call the resilience trap. And you can see this particularly in universities. They go, there's this whole new problem. We do not know how to handle it. And so we're going to invest in resilience. We're going to try to get a level of AI literacy or whatever it might be. And we'll roll out these programs, and they're relatively static, and they're seen as a defense against this new type of technology rather than an adoption for it. So in terms of skills, I mean, I will go right back to Leon Bagrit in 1964, head of Elliott Computers, who always talked about automation not as a need to skill, but as a need to re-educate. he talked about that you needed to deal with this. You needed the level of education to be able to spend time to think about what this means, not just how to use it. To be perfectly honest, I think most people can pick this up very quickly. It is about what does this mean? If you are making a decision about AI, you need to understand what it means for your economy, for your society, for your workers, for you. And that is a much, much harder thing to do because that requires us to, from a university perspective, that requires things that we're not very good at. Because on my reading list, for instance, there is The Machine Stops, 1907 novella by Ian Forster, about what happens when you give up agency to a machine. That's really weird to have on an economics reading list, something that you would normally find in English language. I need bits of philosophy, I need bits of geography, quite a lot of history to bring everything together. And actually, educational institutions en masse, our entire system is not particularly good at that. You will do your English GCSE and you'll do your history GCSE and lots of different ones, and they're isolated and siloed. These AI tools are developed from the entire canon of human knowledge. And so siloing our knowledge in the way that we have done traditionally for the last couple of 100 years really struggles to give people the skills or the education to understand what this means.
I completely agree with that. The interdisciplinary nature of research and teaching, my specialist area, I would probably say, is labor law. And I don't really focus on the legal side of it. I look at it, the social perspective, and why was the law introduced and what's been the impact of it? Because that can help you evaluate whether the law has worked or not. And that certainly needs to be addressed with AI. I think that's absolutely necessary. And that's why your research is so important, because you do look at it from a wider perspective than a lot of researchers do.
And I think you've got, so probably the best insight I have had around the impact of generative AI has come from a linguist. Guy sits in our English department, and he understands probably better than anybody I've spoken to how LLMs change people's decision making, because his field of study has been how people understand the English language and differences between different types of approaches and novels and that kind of thing. Now, I am yet to find an organization or a university or whoever it is who's going, we really need to go and speak to the English language people when we're making our AI strategy. I think there is a real common misunderstanding in our institutions, as you know, I've argued before, about what this type of AI is. For me, generative AI is the first broad, mass market, publicly accessible wave of artificial intelligence. I doubt it will be the last one, but it's the first one. Everybody in organizations that I speak to who is making AI has an AI background and considers AI to be a narrow focus specialist tool. And they're trying to work out how an organization incorporates a narrow focus specialist tool where actually, and this is where we excel in business schools, by the way, what we should be working out is how an organization deals with a mass market, broad artificial intelligence platform. And so you have this kind of difference in approach. It's something that's kind of been shaken out of the sector. I remember even kind of 18 months ago when you were making AI policy, or when we were talking about AI policy in various institutions, people were talking to the computer scientists, of which you should do, of course. But this type of AI is actually an economic question, it's a sociological question, it's a humanities question as well.
I completely agree, and I think that it does certainly get lost. But we're kind of coming to the end of the episode. It's been a fascinating talk. Like I mentioned at the very start, I always really enjoy a conversation because it's not something that I do on a day-to-day basis, but I'm fascinated by it. And in the world of law and HR, AI is becoming into it a lot. We work with a lot of companies who are using AI within their services now. What are you working on next, though, Richard?
So at the moment, most of my work is looking again at the regional economy, so the impacts for Greater Manchester on what AI means for the labour force, what it means for economy and society. Will our organisations make that minimum viable choice? Will they make the cost-cutting choice? Or will they make the kind of economic growth and value choice? And I think that's kind of the next big question. Much more prosaically, I am currently writing a piece on, if you remember after 2008, there was massive criticism of the economics profession about being able to predict the crisis. So my current piece of work, which will be available on SSRN in the next couple of days, is trying to work out if those lessons have prepared economics for an AI type crisis, or whether or not the crises are now so disparate and so unpredictable that actually you can't really prepare for.
I remember that in 2008. I remember lots of discussion saying, it's happened for centuries and how people, how people can't predict it. But I thought, in their defense, in the economic specialists or commentators' defense, the world changes and it's the variables that affects it. So sometimes it might be difficult. I'm not too sure about that, which way I would kind of view it.
I mean, I agree with you. I do. The thing about economics, and again, I won't go into it too much, but in 2008, you had a relatively strong ideological belief in the primacy of markets. And in essence, markets would not make a wrong decision. I think it's Alan Greenspan who said 2008 was the destruction of his entire intellectual edifice. You have this belief and education and models that supported this belief that the more complex a market was, the more diverse it was, and therefore the less risk there was in complexity. For instance, when you couldn't understand something, it meant it was very diverse and therefore much more safer. For instance, and so you had this kind of, I remember, I think it was 2008, where you had Joseph Stiglitz writing, "We need a new economic paradigm. We need a new way of looking at our economy, because for the last 30 years, economics has turned into a science or a quasi-science based on the belief of rational man, that somebody will always make the most rational decision." And so part of what my research into kind of, is this AI a bubble or not, talks about is, are people making rational decisions? Are people getting too caught up in the hype? Is this kind of a Minsky-esque bubble where we go through kind of various stages of excitement, hype, and then something happens to change the market, and that $3 trillion that we talked about earlier is all sucked back out very, very quickly? If that happens, you'll have huge economic consequences, arguably bigger than 2008 in terms of crash and crisis. And that will be real. It won't be in the numbers. That will be things that we will see and feel on the streets of Salford, in terms of interest rate changes, in terms of mortgage payments, in terms of debt, in terms of employment and unemployment. But that seems like a very pessimistic note to end on, so I'll happily take another question.
Well, we do have one final question, which we ask every single guest. If you could choose one person or a group of people who you believe has influenced the world of work, who would that person be and why?
Very good question. So I am going to go for Tom Lupton in the 50s and 60s, and all this work around piecework and assembly lines and production. And I argue, I've got a paper in Work, Employment and Society a few years ago that argues that many of the insights of nudge and behavioral economics were first found in Tom Lupton's work.
Okay, it's not somebody that I'm that familiar with, but I'm certainly going to do a bit of research on that and then put a link into the episode as well, just to make our listeners more aware of Tom's work, if that's okay. It's always great to talk to you, Richard. I always find our discussions fascinating. You're a fascinating person to talk to about your work. You're very enthusiastic, and you're doing some fantastic research in the Northwest, in particular of England as well. So, Professor Richard Whittle, thank you for joining us on We Can Work It Out.